The ICU at night is a world of its own. There's a unique tension there, from the seriousness of our patients' conditions to the stress of concerned and overwhelmed family members. The constant beeping of monitors melds with the low hum of the air conditioning, and somewhere in the background, the steady drip of IVs fills the silence like a relentless metronome. Working the overnight shift, you come to know the rhythms of the place, the times of calm, and the inevitable waves of chaos that crash through no matter the hour. It was my first week on nights, and I had already noticed how different it felt after dark. A kind of tension simmered beneath the surface, threading its way through every hallway and into every room. Even the patients seemed more restless, twitching and murmuring in their sleep, their bodies struggling to get better. But what unsettled me most was something the head nurse, Linda, said on my first shift. Linda was a tall, stern woman in her 60s with a lined face and eyes that seemed to have seen everything. When I first arrived, she sat me down, gave me the usual rundown of protocols and patient assignments, and then leaned in, her eyes even more serious over her reading glasses. "There's one thing you need to remember on this shift," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Every night, by exactly 2:59 a.m., you need to make sure all the patients' doors are closed. Every single one. And no matter what you hear, you don't open them until 3:10. Understand?" I laughed a little, thinking it was some sort of hazing ritual for the new nurse, but Linda's expression didn't change. "It's not a joke," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There's something about that time. You need to follow this rule." I nodded, not wanting to come off as rude, but I didn't put much stock into what she was saying. I'd worked plenty of night shifts at other hospitals, and while every place had its share of spooky stories, I wasn't one to get rattled easily. Still, the way Linda looked at me, like she truly believed this, left a little chill in my bones. The first few nights were uneventful. I went about my tasks, made small talk with the other nurses, and before 2:59 a.m. rolled around, I followed Linda's instructions, making sure each door was firmly shut. I'd hear strange noises sometimes. Movement, like monitors rolling, maybe footsteps, but I chalked it up to patients moving in their beds. Then came the night I decided to see what would happen if I didn't follow the rule. It was a quiet shift, just past 2:50 a.m., and I was at the nurse's station, reviewing charts. Linda had called in sick that night, and without her hawk-like gaze, I felt rebellious. It was a stupid thought, but I couldn't shake the curiosity. What would happen if I did leave the doors open? I waited, watching the second hand tick closer to 2:59 a.m. I stayed seated, my eyes flickering to the patient monitors. Everything was normal. Heart rates were steady, oxygen levels stable. 2:59 a.m. came and went, and I stayed put. The hallways were darker this time of night, with the overhead lights dimmed. I glanced down the corridor, where the doors of the patient rooms were slightly ajar, shadows spilling out into the hallway. At 3:01 a.m., it started with a noise. Something soft and distinct, like fabric being dragged across the floor. I stood up, straining to listen, and the sound grew louder, coming from somewhere down the hall. My heart rate picked up as I turned the corner, peering into the darkness. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open wider, inch by inch. My mouth went dry as I took a step forward. The dragging sound was coming from that room 309. I squinted, trying to make out what was moving inside. And then I saw it. Something was standing just inside the doorway. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a shape, a figure hunched over. It was tall, taller than any of the patients on this floor, and it was well past visiting hours. It moved strangely, like it was swaying. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on that figure. The door creaked again, opening wider, and the figure stepped out into the hallway. The ground almost fell out from under me as I realized it wasn't walking, it was gliding, hovering a few inches above the floor. It had no feet, no solid form, just a shadowy mass that shifted and pulsed like smoke. It turned its head, if you could call it a head, toward me, and I caught a glimpse of something pale within the darkness. A face, but not a human face. Its features were twisted and stretched like someone had tried to mold it out of clay and failed horribly. Its eyes, they were wide and empty, two gaping holes that seemed to drink in the light. It opened its mouth. No, not its mouth, but a slit that ran across its face. A low whisper spilled out, "You didn't shut the doors." The words reverberated through the hallway, and I stumbled back on weak legs. The figure's head tilted as if it were listening, and then it began to move, to glide down the hallway toward one of the other open rooms. I should have run. I should have turned and sprinted out of there, but instead I watched in horror as the figure slipped through the open doorway of room 305. A second later, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It was the patient, a frail, elderly woman who had been admitted for a minor heart condition. The sound of her screams was like nothing I'd ever heard before, raw, unfiltered terror that echoed off the walls. I broke out of my stunned stupor and ran toward the room. I skidded to a stop just outside the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The door was wide open, and the room was pitch black. The only sound was the woman's screams mingling with something else, a wet, slurping noise. I forced myself to move, lunging for the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, and I stumbled backwards. The woman was in her bed, her face twisted in agony, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Hovering over her, its shadowy form stretched out like some grotesque spider, was the figure. Its mouth, if you could call it that, was pressed against her chest, and as I watched, it pulled away, something dark and glistening in the slit of its mouth. It was holding her heart. The woman's screams cut off abruptly, her body going limp. The figure turned toward me. The gaping holes where its eyes should have been seemed to lock onto mine. "You didn't shut the doors," it repeated, and then it was gone, disappearing into the wall like smoke dissipating in the wind. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I burst through the emergency exit and out into the cold night air. I doubled over, retching, my mind spinning with what I'd just seen. The police and the hospital administration ruled it as a tragic medical complication, but I knew the truth. I was put on leave and haven't returned to the ICU since. The last I heard, room 309 is still empty. They can't seem to keep a patient in there for long. Some say it's haunted, some say it's cursed, but I know better. I didn't shut the doors, and I'll never forget what came through them because I didn't. I settled into the rocking chair in the corner of the nursery, gently swaying back and forth, cradling Ava against my chest. Her tiny, soft whimpers echoed in the otherwise silent house. It was nearly midnight, and Christina was working her overnight at the hospital. I looked at my phone, hoping for a text, but nothing yet. I shifted my weight, feeling Ava's warmth seep through my shirt as her fussing quieted to soft whines. "It's okay, sweetheart. I murmured, brushing my hand over her wispy hair. Mommy will be home soon. The creak of the front door opening made me glance up. Surprise washed over me. Christina was home? I listened as the door closed with a gentle click. Her familiar footsteps moved softly across the living room floor, the faint rhythm unmistakable, even in the nursery. I smiled and bounced Ava lightly, feeling the tension of the long evening begin to melt away. Honey, you're home early, I called out, keeping my voice low to avoid startling Ava. She stirred slightly in my arms, and her eyes flickered open, searching. I watched as Christina's shadow appeared at the entrance to the hallway, her form barely illuminated by the soft nightlight spilling from the nursery. Hey, babe. Christina's voice drifted down the hall, calm and even. Rough night? Ava's tiny body shifted in my arms, her eyes focusing past me and towards the hallway. The baby's face relaxed, a small smile tugging at her lips. I followed her gaze, looking over my shoulder, and saw Christina standing just outside the light in the hallway, a shadowy figure in her boxy scrubs, long hair hanging loose around her shoulders. I laughed. Yeah, a bit. Glad you're here now. Christina stood there for a second, silent and still, as if taking us in, father and daughter. Then she turned, walking further down the hallway toward our bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. As she passed, Ava's gaze followed her every movement, her small head turning in my arms. I stared after Christina, noting her quiet footsteps, the familiar way she carried herself, and the way her hair gleamed under the dim glow. Everything about her seemed so ordinary. Just Christina, home from work. The tension in my shoulders eased even more. I settled Ava back into the crib, brushing a kiss across her forehead before straightening up. Let's go say hi to Mommy, okay? I whispered, though Ava was already drifting back to sleep. I quietly tiptoed out of the nursery, pulling the door closed just enough so the nightlight would filter through. The house was silent again, except for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I moved down the hallway and stopped outside our bedroom door, imagining Christina tossing her scrubs into the hamper and collapsing onto the bed, exhausted. Hey, I said softly, pushing the door open. How is your... The words caught in my throat. The bedroom light was on now, but it was empty. The bed was still neatly made, covers pulled tight as if no one had touched them since morning. No scrubs on the floor, no shoes kicked off by the door, nothing. I blinked, confusion tangling with a sudden spike of anxiety. Christina? No response. I stepped further into the room, glancing around like maybe I'd missed her somehow. But there was nowhere to hide. The bathroom door stood open, lights off. The closet, too. Every space was empty. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the sudden disorientation. I'd just seen her. She'd walked past me. She'd spoken to me. My gaze snapped to the window. I pulled the curtain back, and my heart dropped like a stone in my chest. Her car wasn't in the driveway. There was no way. There was no way she'd just disappeared in the span of a few seconds. My pulse pounded in my ears as I hurried back down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned on every light, each flickering bulb adding to the eerie silence around me. I ran back through the living room, the kitchen, and the front entryway. Christina? I called again, louder, panic clawing at the edges of my voice. Still nothing. I stumbled back to the nursery, throwing the door open. Ava stirred in her crib, but didn't wake. I stared down at her, my breathing short. She'd seen Christina, too, hadn't she? I could swear she had. She'd looked right at her, even smiled. I backed away slowly, pressing a hand to my forehead. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe it was just stress. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling, and opened the text messages. Christina usually texted when she was on her way home, but there were no messages. I hit the call button for Christina, holding my breath as it rang once, twice. Hey, it's Christina. I'm either busy or... I hung up, throat tightening. The robotic voice of the voicemail mocked me. I shot a glance down the hallway again, half expecting to see her standing there, but all I saw were shadows. And then I remembered. I'd watched it, turn down the hallway, had watched it stop right there, just outside our bedroom door, exactly where I'd first seen her. Slowly, I moved back down the hall, the distance seeming to stretch impossibly long, each step like wading through quicksand. I stopped outside the bedroom, staring down at the spot where her figure had stood. The carpet was indented. 2 distinct, perfectly formed prints, as if something heavy had stood there, right there. My blood ran cold as I stared at them, my thoughts scattering in every direction. I knelt, hesitating before reaching out to brush my fingers against the imprints. They were still faintly warm, like someone or something had just been standing there. What the hell? I whispered, my voice breaking the silence. I stood up abruptly, my gaze snapping back down the hall, back to the nursery where Ava slept soundly. I didn't know what I'd seen. I didn't know who or what had walked through my house, spoken to me in my wife's voice, moved like her. But one thing was terrifyingly clear. Whatever it wasn't Christina. And it had walked into our bedroom and then vanished. And then suddenly, I felt it again. A presence. Something was here inside the house that I couldn't see. I felt it watching me, lurking just out of sight. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the hallway as I fumbled for the nursery door handle. I slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat there in the darkness, beside Ava's crib, heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. And I stayed like that, staring into the shadows until the first light of dawn crept through Ava's nursery window. I never told Christina what happened. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to tell her. On those nights when Christina's working, that nursery door stays closed, and I keep my silent watch until sunrise. Because some of those nights, when I sit in that same chair rocking Ava to sleep, I hear it. The front door creaks open, the soft, familiar footsteps padding through the house, stopping at the nursery door, and I see 2 foot shadows beneath the door. And it's not Christina. My sister and her husband had been planning a cruise for months. So when she asked me to watch their kids for the week, I agreed without hesitation. I was the cool aunt, and Harper, their oldest at 7, and Ben, their chubby-cheeked 4-year-old, were good kids, easy enough for me to manage. Their routine was simple: dinner, a movie, and then bed. It seemed like a perfect, low-key evening as I set them up with popcorn and a Disney movie in the living room. Harper cuddled up beside me on the couch, her small frame wrapped up in a pink fleece blanket. She was always a little shy, but tonight she seemed particularly quiet. I chalked it up to her parents being away. Ben sat cross-legged on the floor, completely engrossed in the animated characters dancing across the screen. The movie's cheerful music echoed softly through the dimly lit room, casting a comforting glow against the backdrop of shadows beyond the living room. Everything was peaceful, ordinary, until Harper leaned over, her breath warm against my ear. "The gray people are back," she whispered. I froze, the words lodging in my throat. "What did you say, sweetie?" Her tiny hand gripped my arm, her gaze fixed on something over my shoulder, in the direction of the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms. The gray people, they're watching us again with their white eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I glanced at the hallway, the shadows seeming to deepen, but I couldn't see anybody. I looked back at Harper. She was serious. Her usually bright eyes were wide and unblinking. I forced a smile, hoping it masked the fear creeping down my spine. "Harper, what do you mean? What gray people?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She just stared at the hallway, speaking in a soft, hollow voice. "They come when it gets dark. They stand there, and they watch us, just like before, but I didn't tell Mommy 'cause she wouldn't believe me." My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to process what she was saying. Harper had never talked about anything like this. I glanced at Ben, who was still completely immersed in the movie, oblivious to us. "They have white eyes," Harper continued, her voice trembling slightly. "No faces, just those eyes. Sometimes they whisper." "Whisper? Harper, what do they whisper?" "I don't know, but they don't like it when I look at them. They hide behind the walls, but I can still see them." She pointed a tiny finger at the hallway, her hand shaking. "Like right now, they're right there." I turned slowly, eyes wide, as I peered into the darkness. For a moment I saw nothing, just the dim outline of the hallway, the closed doors to the bedrooms, and the bathroom door slightly ajar. But then there was a flicker of movement. Something so subtle, a faint shift of shadows near the end of the hall. No, it had to be my imagination, triggered by Harper's words. But then I saw it. A small flash of pale gray just at the corner of the hallway wall, and those eyes, two tiny pinpricks of milky white, like distant stars staring back at me. I grabbed Harper's hand, squeezing it tight. "We're going to my house, okay?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. Harper nodded, but her gaze never left the hallway. I stood slowly, lifting her up into my arms, and reached for Ben's shoulder. "Hey, buddy, let's go for a little ride, okay? We'll finish the movie at my place." Ben looked up, confused. "But it's not done yet." "We'll watch it there. Come on now," I urged, my voice sharper than I intended. I glanced back at the hallway. The shadows shifted again. This time it wasn't subtle. It was like a ripple in the darkness, the pale eyes blinking once, twice, before disappearing. I didn't wait to see more. I scooped Ben up under my other arm and half ran, half stumbled to the front door. Fumbling with the locks, I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway was darker now, a suffocating blackness swallowing the space. A low hum seemed to pulse from the walls, a deep vibration I could feel in my bones. "They're coming," Harper whimpered, burying her face in my arm. "Don't let them get us." I practically tore the door open and bolted outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. My car was parked in the driveway, and I fumbled with the keys, shoving Harper and Ben into the back seat as quickly as I could. I jumped behind the wheel, hands trembling as I started the engine. My eyes darted to the house, specifically to the living room window. A tall, thin shape stood just inside, silhouetted against the faint glow of the TV. It was featureless, a gray blur, but it was watching us leave. I slammed the car into gear and peeled out of that driveway. As we sped down the street, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The house was just a tiny dot in the distance now. "Are they gone?" Harper whispered from the back seat. I didn't know how to answer her. I didn't know if they were gone or if they'd follow us. But one thing was certain, there was no way we were staying in that house for another minute. Not until my sister and her husband got back. And even then, I'd make sure they knew what was going on. because whatever those things were, I had a sickening feeling that next time they wouldn't be content with just watching. It was close to closing time when a car pulled into the lot. The shiny black sedan crept forward under the dimming evening light, its headlights momentarily blinding me as I stood at the desk inside the rental office. I straightened up, watching the man get out. I remembered the guy's name, Carl, because he'd rented the car for over a week, longer than usual for our location. He was a wiry guy in his late 40s and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His suit hung loosely off his body, and there were dark circles under his eyes, giving him the look of someone worn thin by something far worse than just work stress. He avoided eye contact as he walked up to the desk, keys in hand, moving like he couldn't get rid of the car fast enough. "There's something wrong with the car," he mumbled, dropping the keys onto the counter with a slight tremor in his hands. "I heard some noises the first few days, and there's been a smell." I frowned, more out of confusion than concern. Our cars were always cleaned between rentals, and nothing had been noted in the record. But Carl was insistent. "Well," I said, grabbing the clipboard and heading out to the car, "let's take a look." The car sat there, sleek and spotless under the parking lot's lights. On the outside, everything looked fine, no dents, no scratches. But as I opened the driver's side door and slid inside, a strange metallic smell hit me, like copper mixed with something stale. I froze, momentarily stunned by the scent. I looked back at Carl, who was now standing by the office door, watching me. He gave a weak nod as if urging me to continue. I turned back and started out with the basics, running through the usual checklist. Nothing seemed out of place at first. I looked things over inside the car and then worked my way toward the back seat. The back seat was empty. But the smell was stronger there. I wondered whether there was a dead mouse somewhere inside the car. I reached down between the driver's seat and the backrest, searching for whatever might be causing the smell. That's when I felt it. A cold, matted texture, soft but slick. My stomach lurched as I pulled out a small purse, stained by something dark. Could it be blood? I yanked my hand back. For a split second, I was frozen, running through the possibilities. I was about to tell Carl I'd found it, the possible source of the smell, when other thoughts chilled me. Maybe Carl had done something horrific. I thought about having to call the cops, but before I could make a decision, I realized I was leaned far into the back seat of this car with Carl behind me. There was an eerie silence, the only sound my own shallow breathing. I took a deep breath and leaned forward again, pushing through the overwhelming sense of dread that had wrapped itself around me. I pushed the purse back into the slot where I'd found it and slid out of the back seat, my legs shaky, intent on finishing the inspection without alerting Carl. I circled around to the back of the car. Maybe it was nothing, and my imagination was just getting to me. I found myself wishing I hadn't sent my coworker home early on this late shift. I popped the trunk. The smell hit me first, a foul stench of rot that made my stomach churn. Gagging, I shone the flashlight inside. The gray cut pile carpet was stained dark, and I screamed when I saw fingertips poking out from under the floorboard. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The bile rose in my throat, but I fought it down, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the flashlight. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I'd seen a lot of things working in car rentals, drunk drivers, forgotten items, weird stains, but nothing like this. Nothing this horrifying. I had to call the police. I had to get help. But as I turned to run back to the office, I remembered Carl was there, standing in the doorway between me And the phone. His face twisted into an unsettling, triumphant smirk. His eyes were wide and wild, locked onto mine, and for the first time I noticed how deeply disturbed he truly looked. The polite, anxious man who had handed me the keys was gone. What stood before me was something far more sinister. "Find anything interesting?" Carl asked, his voice low and dripping with malice. My blood ran cold. I backed away, my mind racing. Carl stepped closer, his hand sliding into his jacket. "I told you," he said, a slight tremor in his voice. "There's something wrong with that car." I couldn't tell if he was holding a weapon or just trying to scare me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Without another word, I turned and bolted for the back exit, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. As I ran, Carl's laughter echoed behind me, cold and menacing, following me into the night like a dark shadow. I didn't stop until I was far from the lot, far from the car, far from him. When I was finally able to get to a phone and send the police to the rental office, Carl, or whoever he was, had been long gone, along with all the day's cash and the car. Let that sink in. With all the available cars on our lot, he left with that same car and decomposing body. It was a stupid idea from the start, but October has a way of making bad decisions feel like adventures waiting to happen. Our small New England lake town had long since passed its tourist season, leaving the streets empty and the air thick with that particular crisp autumn chill. No one had been to the old mini golf course in years, and there were rumors it was going to be torn down and paved over for parking. The place was practically a relic, abandoned and overgrown, its tacky pirate statues and clown sculptures left to rot in the weeds. But the tunnels, that's what drew us in. No one remembered exactly why the course had a network of underground tunnels. Rumors said they were built as some sort of immersive experience back when the course opened, a gimmick to get tourists to pay extra. Others said the tunnels predated the golf course entirely, relics from something older, something no one wanted to talk about. They were closed off to the public after some incidents in the 80s, the details of which were impossible to pin down. A couple kids went missing, or maybe it was just one kid, I don't know. Local legends have a way of twisting stories. So naturally, when my friend suggested we check it out, I didn't argue. We wanted to see the place before it was gone for good. It was late, probably close to midnight. The sky was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, giving off just enough light to cast shadows. We parked near the rusted-out entrance. The once vibrant Lakeside Adventure mini-golf sign now barely legible through the layers of graffiti and grime in the clearing by the woods. The wind carried the faint, eerie whistle of creaking metal from the dilapidated structures scattered across the course. My friend Ben pointed his phone's flashlight toward the entrance and looked at us. I said I was down, and my friend Sarah nodded, but she looked scared. I think she was more scared of being left alone at night so close to the woods. The course itself was spooky enough in the dark, with faded, chipped sculptures of smiling clowns and crumbling castles looming tall in the dark. But the real goal was the tunnels. We made our way to the far corner where the entrance to the underground section was hidden behind a large fiberglass T-Rex, now half collapsed with weeds growing through its teeth, covered in graffiti. The gate that once blocked the tunnel entrance was long gone, probably stolen or torn down by other idiots like us. The air inside was damp, musty, like the tunnel was breathing stale air from a forgotten time. Our flashlight beams barely cut through the thick darkness. and the further we descended, the more oppressive it became. I could hear every breath, every shuffle of shoes against the concrete echoing back at us. The tunnels split off in different directions, some with painted arrows on the walls, others with no markings at all. It felt like a labyrinth, but Ben seemed confident, leading the way. "Are we sure this is safe?" Sarah asked, her voice bouncing off the narrow walls. "It's fine," Ben said, but he didn't sound fine. "Just a few tunnels, we won't go too deep." But we kept going deeper, the walls becoming more cracked, the air cooler with every step. After a while, the narrow hallways opened up into larger rooms, probably where they had planned to build something that never happened. Broken pieces of plastic and wood littered the floor. I stepped on what looked like an old golf ball, and the sound echoed sharply, making me jump. And then, as we stood in one of those rooms, something changed. There was a noise. Not the noises from our own feet, or the distant dripping of water we'd heard within the tunnels and grown used to, but something else. A scraping sound, like metal against stone, slow and deliberate. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her flashlight darting around the room. Ben raised his hand, motioning for us to be quiet. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. It was coming from one of the tunnels we hadn't entered yet, the one to the left, the one that sloped downward to a deeper level. "Let's go," I whispered, already stepping backward. Ben didn't argue, and Sarah was already at my side. We turned, making our way quickly back the way we came, but when the shuffling got louder, closer, we knew something was following us. We picked up the pace, but had to be careful of falling over the trash at our feet. As we approached the exit tunnel, a sudden clang like a door slamming shut behind us made us all jump. The exit tunnel, it didn't look right. It wasn't the same one we'd come through. "This isn't where we came in," Ben said, his voice shaking. We started panicking, spinning in place, trying to get our bearings. We tried another tunnel, but the farther we went, the more unfamiliar it looked. And then that scraping sound again, right behind us. I turned, shining my phone back down the tunnel, and that's when I saw it. Something was hunched over, its pale skin barely visible in the dim light. It dragged something long and metallic behind it, something that looked like a rusted golf club. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the shadows, but it was facing us, watching us, waiting. It took a step forward, and the metal club screeched against the floor. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking the tense silence. We bolted, not knowing where we were going anymore, just trying to get away. The tunnels twisted, the turns becoming tighter, more claustrophobic. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I glanced behind us, and the figure was still there, closer now, its dragging steps impossibly fast. And then we hit a dead end. The tunnel was sealed, bricked over like someone had walled it up recently. There was no way out. The scraping stopped. The figure stood at the mouth of the tunnel, still dragging its club behind it. It lifted its head slowly, revealing a gaping hole where its mouth should have been, lined with sharp teeth and a gray tongue. And then, in the dim light of our phones, its tongue slithered out, like it was tasting the air. I couldn't scream. None of us could. We just backed up against the cold wall, waiting for it to come closer, to close the distance, and, "Hey!" a voice echoed through the tunnel, cutting through the terror. "Get out of there!" A beam of light flashed from behind the figure, and in an instant it was gone. Just vanished, scurried away from the light, down one of the tunnels. The flashlight belonged to some local cop. His voice was gruff and angry. "What the hell are you kids doing down here?" We didn't answer. We didn't need to. We just ran towards him, back out to the surface, gasping for air as we stumbled into the cool night. To this day, we don't know what we saw down there. To this day, we don't know what we saw down there. The place was cleared and is now a parking lot and a storage facility. Of course, I never went back, but every time I hear the scrape of metal on concrete, I think of that thing living, hunting down in those tunnels which may still exist under that building. When I landed my first job at a prestigious law firm downtown, I knew I'd be stuck with the less than desirable office for the first few months. My new office was the size of a broom closet, barely big enough to fit a desk and a filing cabinet, and it came with a musty smell that clung to the air like mildew. So when I found out about the unused wing just past the elevators, I started to wonder why no one had claimed the extra space. From what I could tell, it was an entire hallway of vacant offices, dark, spacious, and silent. I still remember the day I decided to move into that back hallway. In hindsight, it was probably the first mistake of my career at that firm. The offices there were spacious, quiet, and perfect for avoiding the constant interruptions of a busy law firm. My new office was the best of them all, a corner room with large windows that let in plenty of light and a view overlooking the city's skyline. But almost immediately, things began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first, just a creeping unease that prickled the back of my neck. Tom, my assistant, who had started with me just a few weeks prior, seemed more put off than I was. "I heard it's not used for a reason," he murmured. "Something about weird noises, lights flickering. The cleaning staff says they won't even go in there after dark." "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Tom asked as he wheeled in a stack of files. "Oh, it's just office politics. People love their creature comforts. They'd rather squeeze into a smaller office close to the partners than take something like this." I waved a hand dismissively, but I could tell Tom wasn't convinced. "If it makes you feel better, we'll spruce the place up a bit, put a couple of lamps in the hallway. How about that?" He nodded, but his expression didn't change. I brushed it off, chalking his discomfort up to new job jitters. We worked late into the night for the first few weeks, getting things set up and tackling some new cases. After a few late nights, I was sure we'd be back on track and up to speed with the rest of the office. That's when things started getting really weird. It was around 8 p.m. one evening when Tom came into my office, his face a shade paler than usual. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it like he needed the support. "Something's going on here." "What is it now?" I asked, setting down my pen. He hesitated, then pointed down the hall. "The office across from mine. The door keeps slamming shut on its own." I looked at him, half smiling. "Maybe it's just a hydraulic door or something." "No, it's not. And every time I go to open it, it's like it resists, like something's holding it closed. And then when I do get it open," he stopped, licking his lips nervously, "there's something painted on the back of the door. It's like symbols or something. I can't tell what they are." "Symbols?" My curiosity was piqued. I stood up. "Come on, show me." Tom led me down the hallway. The office door was shut again, just as he'd said. I grabbed the handle, half expecting it to be stuck, but it turned easily under my grip. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond was dark, the faint light from the hallway barely piercing the shadows. But as soon as I glanced at the back of the door, I understood what Tom had been talking about. Someone had painted a series of strange symbols in red ink. They looked old, foreign, a language I didn't recognize, like some twisted version of hieroglyphs. "What the hell is this?" I murmured, leaning in closer. The paint looked fresh, the edges still glistening under the dim light. "I have no idea," Tom replied, his voice strained. "But every time I walk past this door, I get this this feeling like I'm being watched. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. It's just paint. Someone probably had a prank going on here a long time ago and forgot to clean it up. But Tom didn't laugh. That door was fine yesterday. There wasn't any paint on it yesterday. That made me pause. Are you sure? Yes. I didn't know what to say to that, but I wasn't going to show Tom that it was unnerving me. I pulled the door closed and stepped back into the hallway. Maybe the janitor's messing with us. I'll talk to HR tomorrow. We headed back to our offices, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how strange those symbols were. And then, just as I sat down at my desk, I heard it. Slam! The door crashed shut again. The one I had just closed myself. I shot to my feet, adrenaline spiking. Tom's office door swung open and he poked his head out, eyes wide. Did you hear that? I nodded, marching back down the hallway. I yanked the door open, expecting to find someone hiding inside. But there was no one there. The room was empty. The air felt stale and heavy. And on the back of the door, the symbols were different. They'd shifted somehow, forming new shapes, as if they'd rearranged themselves when we weren't looking. Tom swore softly behind me. I'm not staying here another minute. Fine, I snapped more harshly than I'd intended. Go home. I'll finish up. He didn't argue. Within minutes, he'd gathered his things and left. I stayed and worked another hour, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking at that damn door, expecting it to slam again. It didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from that dark room. Tom handed in his resignation the next day. No explanation, no notice period, just an email, and he was gone. It was like whatever had happened there was just too much for him. Still, I stayed. I was determined not to let some stupid trick chase me out. The next night, I was in my office, the only light coming from my desk lamp. The hallway was dark, the rest of the floor silent. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned, peering through the glass panel of my door. A shadow, moving slowly, shifting down the hallway like mist. It wasn't just a shadow, it had form. A shape that stretched as it glided down the hallway, passing my door. I was frozen, holding my breath. There was no sound, no footsteps, just this black, inky figure drifting past. It paused outside the office with the painted symbols and seemed to melt through the door. I leapt to my feet, threw open my office door, and charged down the hall, throwing open the door to that room. But it was empty, completely empty, except for the symbols. And in the middle of them was a new shape, like a grotesque handprint smeared in black ink. I heard a humming sound and turned slowly. The shadow was here, at the threshold. It loomed impossibly tall and thin, its head seeming to stretch towards me from its body. I stared, paralyzed, as two pinpricks of red light appeared where its eyes should have been. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as the shadow shifted closer, the air around it growing colder. It just watched me, and I was too terrified to speak. And then, as if some invisible force had pushed it away, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke in the wind. I ran through the door with the symbols, slamming the door shut behind me, and straight to my office, grabbing my coat and keys. I didn't stop running until I was outside. I haven't gone back to that hallway since. Whatever that shadow was, it wasn't human or of this world. And I have a feeling that it's still down there, lurking in that empty hallway, in that room, waiting for someone else to get curious and invade its space. But I can't help thinking about those symbols on the door. Who put them there? And what the hell do they mean? I handed the office keys over to the firm and told them I'd be moving back into my original cramped office near the other associates. They didn't question it. or act surprised. I suspect they already knew. I was in need of a new phone, but couldn't shell out for a brand new one, so I started browsing Facebook Marketplace. It didn't take long to find a deal that seemed too good to pass up. A used but fairly new model for half the retail price. The seller's profile looked normal enough, a local guy, late 20s, even friendly in his messages. He explained he was switching to a different brand and just needed to sell it quickly. After a brief exchange, I met him in a public parking lot. We talked for a bit, he seemed genuine, and I got a good look at the phone. It seemed fine, no cracks, no major scratches. He'd already done the factory reset, so all I had to do was hand over the cash. The whole thing felt like a win. I got a newer phone at a steep discount. It was perfect. After I got home, I set it up and synced it to my service provider. Everything transferred over smoothly from my old phone, my contacts, my apps, my pictures. It worked great, and I felt proud of myself for landing such a great deal. The first few days were uneventful. Calls were clear, texts came in as expected, and I had no issues using it. But then the text started. It was a Saturday night, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch, binge-watching TV. I picked up my phone to check the time and saw a notification. New message. Confused, I tapped the screen. I'm here. That was it. Just those 2 words. No contact name, not even a number. Just, I'm here. All I could do was stare at the phone, confused. I figured it had to be a spam message or something, and I deleted it and went back to watching TV. A few days passed, and I hadn't thought much of it until Wednesday evening when I was sitting at my kitchen table, again alone in the house. I was scrolling through TikTok when another notification popped up. I'm here. The exact same message. I held my breath as I sat up in my chair and checked for the sender, but just like before, there was no number and no contact name. Nothing. Just the message hanging there from out of nowhere. I tried to reason with myself, probably some glitch from the transfer, or an error in syncing up my service. I Googled it, searched forums, and even reset my phone's network settings. But the next night, as I was lying in bed, again alone, the text came again. I'm here. By this point, I was spooked. Each time I received that message, I was completely alone. The timing felt calculated, almost deliberate. I never got it when I was out at work or out with friends, only when the house was quiet, when there was no one around but me. I called my service provider and they ran a diagnostics check on my phone. The rep assured me that everything looked fine on their end. No strange numbers, no external devices linked to my account. They suggested it was probably just a tech error, that maybe my phone was getting delayed texts from the previous owner. But that didn't explain the content of the messages. I'm here. What kind of message was that? The vagueness of it, the sheer simplicity made my skin crawl. It was like someone was answering an unspoken question, like they knew I'd wonder if I was actually alone. The worst incident happened 2 weeks later. It was a late Friday night and I was back on the couch, falling in and out of sleep, the house dark and quiet. But then in the silence my phone vibrated on the table next to me. The screen's light knocked me awake and I knew what it was. But this time, it was different. Worse. I've been here. My stomach dropped. The message hit me like a punch to the gut. I jumped up, clutching my phone with shaking hands as I stared around the empty living room. I started panicking. I checked every door, every window. They were all locked. My alarm system was armed. I was alone. I had to be alone. My hands trembled as I typed back a response for the first time. Who is this? The minutes felt like hours as I waited for a reply, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows felt thicker, like they were pressing in, trying to swallow me whole. I almost screamed when my phone vibrated again. I've been here, in the basement. I dialed 911 with fingers that were clumsy and uncooperative, remembering the basement door was hard to lock. The dispatcher's voice was a lifeline from my deep, dark well of panic. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone's in my house, I blurted, pacing in tight circles. I'm getting messages, texts from someone saying they're in my house. The dispatcher kept me on the line as I frantically explained everything. The texts, the timing, the empty sender field. I could barely catch my breath as I stood frozen in the middle of the living room staring at the basement door, my ears straining for any sound, any hint that someone was really there. The police arrived within minutes. They descended on the basement and checked the house, room by room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as I stayed outside on the porch, shivering in the cold night air. Every passing second felt like an eternity. When the cop in charge came back out, he looked bored. There's no one inside, he said firmly. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding. The house is clear. With a mix of relief and disbelief, I showed him the messages, my voice trembling as I explained everything. Could be someone messing with you, maybe spoofing a number, but I've never seen texts come through without any sender information like that. After a few more questions, the police left. They advised that I stay somewhere else for the night, just in case. I ended up crashing at a friend's place, but I barely slept. My mind replayed every single message, every word. How could anyone know exactly when I was alone? The next day, I made up my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I went straight to a cell phone repair shop and explained the situation. The tech took my phone and ran a series of tests. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. "Did you get this phone new?" he asked, glancing up at me. "No, I bought it on Facebook Marketplace from a guy." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. He sighed and turned the phone around, showing me a small chip that had been hidden beneath the SIM card tray. "This isn't standard. Looks like some kind of tracking device or a bug. Someone's been monitoring you." "What?" "Yeah, I've only seen something like this once before. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." My thoughts spiraled as I tried to grasp what he was saying. Someone had been watching me, tracking me. The seller? I left the shop with the phone turned off and wrapped in aluminum foil at the tech's suggestion. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't sleep. I got rid of the phone the very next day and bought a new cheap one straight from the store. But even now, that screen lighting up with that notification vibration makes me jump, scared to see that nameless, numberless text again. Every now and then, I glance at my new phone screen and wonder if I'll see a new message. I'm still here. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.